Hey y'all, my name is Daphne Hoffacker. I'm the ACPTA Advocacy Chair. This is the kickoff to our education series. And tonight we are hosting Josh Sanderson, who is probably one of the most knowledgeable guys about school funding in our state. So I am going to get out of the way. Josh, do you need, I'm going to make you the co-host in case you need it
No,
for
I
any.
don't. I don't have any. No
Okay.
presentation tonight. I thought, Daphne, you just wanted me to kind of give a brief update discussion about what's going on with the legislature, what we
Yeah.
know so far, that kind of deal.
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, I'm gonna hand it over to you and I'm going to pin you so you show up on the recording. Okay, you can go ahead. Y'all, Josh Sanderson, thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks, Daphne. Thank you, everybody, for taking time out of your evenings. Good evening. My name is Josh Sanderson. I'm the executive director of the Equity Center. We represent about half the school districts in the state, strictly on school finance issues. We're essentially school finance consultants. We work with the legislature in helping to write school finance law and maximize revenue for school districts. So today, I think Daphne just wants me to do a brief kind of discussion on what's going on with the legislature. Up to this point, it's very early, but things are actually moving rather quickly. If anybody has questions or comments as I'm going over some of this information, please speak up, and I'll try to answer your questions. So actually we know very little so far, but what we do know is instructive. Obviously both chambers, the House and the Senate, have released their budgets. It's not nearly as promising as we had hoped for in either of the two budgets. In the Senate version of the next biennial budget, they've got $5.3 billion in increased funding for public schools. Now that sounds good, except for when we start to look at exactly how that money is proposed to be distributed. Of that $5.3 billion, $4.85 billion is eaten up in what they are referring to as the teacher pay raise. It is not a teacher pay raise. It is essentially a stipend. It's a one-time stipend that if they wanted to continue it, they would have to recreate this stipend during the next legislature and the following legislature and have to be recreated over and over again. Now that $4.85 billion is distributed in two ways. It's essentially a $4,000 across the board pay raise for every classroom teacher in the state, all 385,000 classroom teachers. But there's a second component. The second component is if you are a teacher in what's defined as a rural school district, you get an additional $6,000. So a total of $10,000 pay raise. What's defined as rural is school districts with an enrollment of 5,000 or fewer students. And the justification for this additional $6,000 is that TEA presented the legislature with data showing that educators in rural school districts on average get compensated $10,000 less than educators in urban and suburban districts. And so in trying to close that compensation gap, this is the Senate's approach. So that leaves roughly $400 million left over of that 5.3 million or billion that is proposed by the Senate. That's taken up by an increase in the school safety allotment. Current law school safety allotment, the legislature provides about $183 million a year to fund all school safety operations. The problem there is that school districts spend just shy of $1 billion a year on school safety. So the legislature gives them $183 million, and then they essentially spend another $800 million on top of that that's diverted from other programs. I mean, essentially the classroom. And so that's dramatically underfunded. Any increase in school safety allotment funding is going to be a good thing. Another $200 million a year will be fantastic, because what that's going to do for school districts is essentially free up the same amount of money that can go back into the classroom that they were spending on school safety and they were not getting funded for. But that's your $5.3 billion in the Senate for school funding. There's no proposed increase in the basic allotment. The way that current law works is any year a school district gets an increase in funding because the basic allotment goes up. And for those of you who aren't familiar with school finance terminology, the basic allotment is the backbone of all school funding. As the basic allotment goes, school funding goes. Most of your programmatic funding, like special education, career and technology, bilingual education, funding for economically disadvantaged students, all of those are weights in the system. And they're all weights that are multiplied by the basic allotment. So you could not increase special education funding at all. But if the basic allotment goes up, special education funding goes up. because it's multiplied by the basic allotment. So we do anticipate for there to be some type of increase in special education funding. Senator Betancourt has filed legislation that would dramatically rewrite how special education services are provided and how it's funded. That's probably a good thing, except for it's not reflected in the budget as we see it today. It's not currently included. The House has done it slightly differently. The House has the same exact school safety funding increase, so $200 million increase per year, more than doubling the school safety allotment. But they include $4.85 billion for increased public education funding, which just happens to coincide with the Senate's cost of their educator pay raise, but the House doesn't outline exactly how they want to distribute it. So it's the same exact amount, dollar for dollar, of the Senate's classroom teacher stipend. I called it a pay raise. I need to correct that. It is not a pay raise, it's a stipend. But the House doesn't say how they want to distribute it. We do anticipate the House probably coming back in and including some additional revenue for at least a modest increase in the basic allotment. But let's circle back to the basic allotment, because that's essentially the root cause of all of our problems. If you look at the legislature historically over the last 25 years, they've got a pattern of increasing the basic allotment, delivering some substantial discretionary revenue to school districts, and then letting it stay stagnant for 4-year periods. Well, we're in year 6 of the last increase of the basic allotment. That is the root cause of all of our problems. For those of you in AISD, as the basic allotment goes up, recapture goes down. So the increases in the basic allotment, and when I say that, I mean substantial increases in the basic allotment, that solves all number of problems that school districts face. That delivers pay raises. What I was getting to a minute ago, and I sidetracked myself, anytime the basic allotment goes up, school districts have to use at least 30% of the new revenue they get from that increase in the basic allotment to pay for pay raises. 75% of that 30% has to go to classroom teachers. So increases in the basic allotment automatically drive classroom teacher pay raises. And they're true raises, they're permanent. They're not one-time stipends. So that's been our ask of the legislature. Instead of spending $4.85 billion on one-time stipends, put that into the basic allotment, you'd get a several $100 increase in the basic allotment. That automatically drives not just teacher pay raises, but all employee pay raises. Because right now in this environment, school districts, we polled all of our membership, several hundred school districts replied back, and we asked them 2 questions. Did you adopt a deficit budget in the prior school year? 40% of districts said yes. Second question, did you adopt a deficit budget in this school year? 70% of school districts said yes. That all goes back to the stagnant basic allotment over time. A $5 billion, even a $10 billion teacher stipend, that's not going to solve that problem. That doesn't answer the question of having discretionary revenue to not have to adopt a deficit budget and eat into your fund balance. And so, teacher pay raises are absolutely needed. We're not going to say no to that. We're not going to complain about it, but we think it's being delivered in an inefficient way. It needs to be done through the basic allotment, because that does multiple things at the same time. Gives school districts discretionary revenue, delivers pay raises for classroom teachers, delivers pay raises for all the other staff that aren't classroom teachers that also deserve pay raises. And like I said, reduces recapture, does a number of things, all that are necessary. And so, that's our commentary on the budget. There's not a whole lot of details right now outside of they do anticipate rewriting how special education services are provided. They do anticipate increasing significantly school safety funding, still going to be far short of what school districts are actually spending, but it's an improvement and we'll take it. And then delivering some type of teacher compensation increase. And the Senate, they've been very specific about how they want to do that, and that's through a one-time stipend. If you go to what's something I believe all y'all are pretty intimately familiar with, Daphne, they're at the hearing. I just left the hearing to go let my dogs out before I get back to it. So the House has not released their education savings account proposal yet, so we cannot comment on it. But the Senate proposal, we know the details very well. And the Senate proposal is essentially for the 2026-27 school year, so the last year of the next biennium, the education savings account would become active. The comptroller's office has been tasked with administering the program. The legislature is giving them essentially a year to get it up to speed and get it rolling. Through that, the legislature has given the comptroller about $50 million to administer the education savings account. The comptroller has told the legislature they need just shy of 40 new employees for this new department to administer this ESA. And the way this would work is everybody that applies for the ESA is entitled to at least $2,000. So if you're a homeschool student, you would get $2,000 through the ESA. If you apply for the program and enroll in an accredited private school, you get $10,000. And if you're a special education student, you get $11,500. Okay, so to put that into perspective a little bit, if any of your children in public schools are what's considered a regular program student, that means a student that is not bilingual, is not in special education programs, is not in career technology programs, and is not economically disadvantaged. So you're a regular program student. That student's funded at $6,160. If your student whose regular program leaves Austin ISD on Friday and on Monday decides to enroll in the education savings account, they get essentially nearly a 70% increase in state funding overnight for no rationale whatsoever. They go from $6,160 on Friday to $10,000 on Monday. And so our complaint there is that it's entirely arbitrary. There is no rationale for the cost of the proposed ESA. And it's a lot different than how the state funds traditional public school students also, because for a traditional public school student, there's a state local share statewide. Austin's kind of an outlier there, but still receives some state funds. For every single student receiving an ESA, 100% of that money comes from the state, comes from general revenue. So if you look at the state average of what they spend per student, it's about 45% of the cost of a traditional public school student. So a private school student taking an ESA would be more than double of what the state spends on a traditional public school student. If that makes any sense, you're going to think about it for a minute. If they're only funded about 45% of a traditional public school student, they're going to fund 100% at $10,000 of a private school student. It costs the state more than double for every single student who takes it. And that starts to eat up discretionary revenue really quickly. I'm sure that none of you are, very few of you are budget nerds quite like I have to be. But if you look at the fiscal note, and a fiscal note is something that's prepared by the Legislative Budget Board, which is essentially the legislature's accountant. And if a bill is proposed that is going to have a fiscal impact to the state, the Legislative Budget Board has to create a fiscal note. So they released the fiscal note for Senate Bill 2, creating this ESA. What they've said is, okay, yes, it's going to cost $1 billion in the upcoming biennium, but that quickly escalates. And by 2030, so just right down the road, 5 years down the road, it's going to be over $4 billion. It'll be $3 billion in 3 years per year. So in the next biennium, they're saying essentially that the total cost for those 2 years, it's going to be around $7 billion, growing from the current $1 billion. And we think that's even actually a little bit short. Now, something else to think about. If not one single student left a public school to take an education savings account, not a single student statewide, and they just funded the existence private school population, which they're eligible for, and they will apply and they will get this $10,000. That cost to the state is $21 billion for the biennium. And that's not a single public school student leaving a classroom. So this has the potential to get debilitatingly expensive very, very quickly. And, right now we're sitting on a $24 billion budget surplus. So that essentially eats up the entirety of that budget surplus. We found out something else interesting yesterday through some testimony by the Legislative Budget Board and Senate Finance. And, we watch state revenue very closely because that state revenue is obviously what we use to fund our public schools. If you remember during the previous legislature, in the second called special session, the legislature got their property tax relief package passed. It was Senate Bill 2, and it was a combination of two things. It was property tax Tier 1 M&O rate compression. So your Tier 1 M&O tax rate went down, and they increased the homestead exemption from the prior $40,000 up to $100,000. The cost of that package for the biennium, we were told, was $18 billion. We found out yesterday that TEA essentially had used some wrong numbers calculating the cost of that property tax relief package, and the actual cost is $22.7 billion. So a $4.7 billion swing in what everyone was told it cost versus what it actually really cost. So that's from a fiscal perspective, that is our biggest concern about the proposed ESA program. We can be against it philosophically as much as we want to be, and we are. But you also have to look at it from a financial perspective, because current law tier 1 tax rate compression happens every single year, even if the legislature does absolutely nothing. If the legislature takes no action, tier 1 rates across the state for school districts are going to go down every single year. That starts to eat up available general revenue. In fact, the legislature has spent since 2019, when they put this into effect, they've essentially spent about $37 billion on property tax reduction. And that $37 billion has to be reappropriated every 2 years to keep rates down. And it's not just that $37 billion cost grows because the legislature periodically goes back and does things to accelerate property tax reduction, like increase the homestead exemption. The Senate is proposing increasing the homestead exemption yet again. That's good for us for homeowners, but it's got a cost. And that's about another $3 billion to get it up to the $140,000 they want to increase it to now. So if you add all of that together, the past expenditures on property tax reduction and the current proposals by Senate leadership right now at this current time on property tax reduction, that gets us to a biennial cost of about $51 billion just on property tax reduction. And again, once again, I have to reiterate that $51 billion is in perpetuity. It's not a one-time expenditure. It's every single legislature. They've got to reappropriate that $51 billion. Property tax reduction is a good thing. I'll never complain about it, but it's got a consequence. And for every dollar you spend on property tax reduction, that's a dollar you don't have for public schools, state infrastructure, you name it, whatever your priorities are. So with this ESA program, or just generally the creation of any new entitlement program, specifically a multi-billion-dollar entitlement program like the ESA, we know is going to be, because the Legislative Budget Board has told us so. What that does, in those two things in conjunction, property tax reduction and the new ESA entitlement, it simply accelerates the timeline for when the state eventually runs out of general revenue, discretionary revenue, to increase public education funding. There is a point in time to where the cost of property tax reduction is going to eat up all discretionary revenue. So just to put it into perspective, what school districts right now are responsible for, their tax collections, just in, not total tax collections, but just their tier 1, their primary operating expenses. That's about $28 billion in tax collections per year in tier 1. That is eventually going to be the total cost of the state's property tax reduction per year, because again, your rate goes down every single year based on just current law. Again, that goes back to what I mentioned a minute ago. Even if the legislature does nothing, your rate goes down. The state doesn't have $28 billion a year in discretionary revenue to spend. We have $24 billion right now for the biennium, so $12 billion per year. But the state has put us on a path to being obligated for eventually eliminating $28 billion in public education funding and replacing it dollar for dollar with state funding. So it's not a reduction in funding for schools, but it is replacing local dollars for state dollars. Does that make sense, Daphne?
Yeah, and so recently I was told that the state is only contributing 27%, but they're supposed to be contributing 50. What is that related to?
They're closer. The state share is closer to 45%. Really, it's more than 27. But and this is something that I think is important, and maybe y'all don't, but we get lost, I think, sometimes in how we talk about things. When we talk about state share, and all of us do it, me included. When we talk about state share, a lot of us go to the legislature or go to our elected officials and say, we want you to increase the state share, right? Okay. I would suggest you say what we're actually meaning, which is the state needs to increase funding, because the state can increase their share of the overall public education funding pie without giving school districts an additional dollar. And tax rate compression does that, because what they're doing is they're spending revenue and they're just swapping local dollars for state dollars. That $37 billion they've already spent is just taking away a local dollar and adding a state dollar. That increases the state share. So the pie doesn't get bigger, but the state share of the pie gets bigger. And so when we say that and they deliver it, they say, well, hey, look, the state share has gone up to 45%. It was 40% 3 years ago. Well, They did what we asked, but that's not what we really meant. What we really meant was increase our funding, make the pie bigger. At the end of the day, it really matters none where the money comes from. If it comes locally from the school district primarily, or if it comes primarily from the state. I think what most of us are concerned with is saying that the overall funding amount is not adequate. So instead of saying increase your share, state, say I think what we all really mean, which is you need to increase overall funding. Funding is inadequate.
I think you're right. There are two things. That reminds me, Brian Harrison brings out on the House side, it throws out these numbers that include that compression as if it is funding our schools. And can you help me understand that so that we can fight that? What do you say when Brian Harrison tells you we spend $16,000 per student?
Yeah, so when they pull out that number, and it's something they've been circulating for a while now. I think we have possibly some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
So if you look at that number, Daphne, it's interesting. TEA, and it's not entirely TEA's fault. It's the legislature directed them to do this. So TEA went in and calculated the overall amount of funding per student, and they took a really interesting snapshot, or they picked an interesting time to do it, because they picked the 2022-23 school year to do the calculation. And they picked that because that was the year federal ESSER funds were inflated. They were much more than a typical school year, the amount the federal funding a school district gets in that school year. So TEA took all school district traditional operating funds, which is about $10,800 per student, in operational funds, M&O, maintenance and operation. And then they took all statewide school district bonded debt, whether your school district has a bond or not. They took all statewide district bonded debt and they divided it by the number of students in the state. And that comes out to about an additional $2,000 per student. And then they put on top of that the inflated federal funds, including the ESSER dollars. And then they put some administrative costs and contract fees on top of that to get to a little over $15,000 per student. If you look at the beginning of every legislative session, the TEA has to releases what's essentially the State of Public Education report. It's called the annual report. And in that report that was released last week, they report both numbers. They report the $15,000 and change number. And then later on in the report, deeper down into it, they go in and say, oh, but what school districts are actually getting for operational expenses is about $10,800 a kid.
Is that what it is right now?
Roughly.
Wow.
And again, that's operational expenses. If you want to get into all fees that school districts are collecting, state and local, it's really closer to probably about 13,000. But for operations, what they have for, to pay salaries and to make a school district run on a daily basis, according to TEA, it's about $10,800.
Okay, I've seen that 12.8 number somewhere.
It's moved around. They've recalculated it several times, and every time they do, it goes up.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not putting this on TEA. This was the legislature said go calculate the average amount per student based on all these criteria. And that was all the federal funds, state bonded debt, and they told them how they had to calculate it. And so I'm not going to put that entirely on TEA. I'll say it was directed by the legislature.
Yeah, I have a couple of other comments, and one of our at the hearing, one of our moms just had this wonderful testimony, basically saying you're putting $1 billion towards vouchers. We know it's going to be bigger than that, but that's what you're saying in SB2. $1 billion towards vouchers, but AISD pays $900 million in recapture.
Right.
So doesn't that mean that we are fundamentally paying for the vouchers?
You could say that sort of, and my Austin parents don't get mad at me here because I was an Austin taxpayer. My kids went to school there, but there's a lot of misconception out there about the whole recapture argument. I hear it over and over again, and I understand it because it's frustrating. But every dollar the state collects in recaptured funds from every district that pays in, it does go back into the budget, the public education budget. By law, there's statute that directs it has to be what's referred to as a method of finance for the entire statewide foundation school program. So you can literally go into the state budget and see where recaptured funds a total amount and where they put it back in to fund the program. And so it does go back into public education statewide. Now, two things can be true at the same time. If those funds didn't exist, the state would have to use their dollars, general revenue dollars, to fund that line item, that method of finance. And so it does free up other state dollars to be spent elsewhere. That is true. But technically speaking, it does go back into the TEA public education budget in its entirety, dollar for dollar. It has to. If they don't, they would be violating state law. And I track that very carefully every single 2 years when they build the budget. You go and you look and see how much they collect, and you go and look and see how much that they put in that line item to fund K through 12 public education. It's there. They do it, but it just offsets state dollars.
So, but yeah, that does make sense. And I totally understand that. But as a taxpayer, my burden would be different, right? If the state were not depending on recapture dollars, my recapture dollars to fund this. Is this right? Or no matter what, my taxes would be
Yeah,
the
there's
same?
really not a strong correlation between higher tax rates and being in a recapture district. In fact, many of them
Okay.
have very low tax rates. So there's really not a strong correlation there. But I got a couple questions here. I want to get to them real quickly. Autumn Kips, you asked specifically, do you ask them to increase the basic allotment? Absolutely. It's the best way to, like I said earlier, do a number of things. That drives pay raises, not just for teachers, but for all staff. And the vast majority of it, though, has to go to teachers. When you increase the basic allotment, you increase the district's entitlement, which decreases recapture. And so it does a number of things. It increases special education funding because special education is a component, is multiplied by the basic allotment. So you multiply your existing special education weights by an increased basic allotment, special education funding goes up. Funding for economically disadvantaged kids goes up. Funding for bilingual programs goes up. And so it's essentially the core component of everything in the school finance system. So yes, that is our ask. That's what we're doing with the legislature, is working to try to maximize the basic allotment. It's extremely expensive. Now, think about this. It's hard to wrap your mind around a lot of these numbers that are in the billions. But for every $100 increase in the basic allotment, it costs $740 million per year. So for in a biennial budget like the state writes, it's about $1.5 billion to increase the basic allotment $100, $200, $3 billion, and so forth and so on. So it gets expensive fast, but that's just the way it works out because we have so many kids.
And the basic allotment right now is 6160?
6160, yes, ma'am.
Okay.
It's been stagnant that way since 2019. Prior to 2019, it was $5,140.
Creighton called it a culture. He said something positive about what did he call it? The budget culture that they've adopted in the Senate. And he made it sound like it was totally fine that they hadn't supported our schools in all these years.
So what he said, he's referring back to something he said 2 years ago. And he said that school districts need to get used to the new budget culture. And the new budget culture, as far as they're concerned, is going to be no more substantial increases in the basic allotment. They just want to fund programs. They want to fund the specific programs that they want to fund, and they'll give marginal, nominal increases to the basic allotment over time. They don't want to give school districts discretionary revenue
because they think that we're wasting it. So Josh, I think you're the one who told me, what is the correlation between the growth in administrators and the mandates?
So it's really twofold. The primary growth, and you can track it back. You can look back at, as the accountability system, the legislature made the accountability system more rigorous over the past 20 years or so. Every time the accountability system gets more rigorous and the state puts more mandates on school districts, you see ticks up in the number of administrators because of those changes to the accountability system. And so as the accountability system grew and became more rigorous, you got more administrators. Those track pretty closely. I got another question here. Christy Littman, you asked, why does Austin pay so much more in recapture than Dallas or Houston? So recapture is a function of two things. It's a function of the amount of property value wealth within your school district and essentially the number of kids you have. So Austin has both those things going against them, because your Austin property values, just values, continue to skyrocket at the same time that enrollment in Austin has gone down. And so you have fewer kids and property values are higher, recapture goes up. The way recapture works is the state calculates a district's entitlement, what they're entitled to by law, based on really three things. The characteristics of the district, the number of students you have and the characteristics of those students. When I say that, I mean, are those students economically disadvantaged? Are they bilingual? Are they special education? That is your entitlement. And then to fund your entitlement, the state looks at, okay, how much in property taxes are you collecting locally? And if you collect more than you're entitled to, everything above that entitlement line goes back to the state. So Houston has more kids and less property value. Dallas has more kids and lower property value. And so as such, their recapture is less. But let me warn you against something else, because last session was a perfect, kind of the perfect storm for this. When you just go in and say reduce our recapture, it is very similar to that conversation about increase the state share, because the state can reduce your recapture to zero without giving you an additional dollar. And that happened to a school district last year. Property tax compression bought the school district out of recapture. They no longer paid it. And in the process, they didn't get an extra penny. In fact, they lost money because of it. And so just saying increase the state share doesn't mean you're going to get more money. Just saying reduce our recapture doesn't mean you're going to get additional revenue. Those things aren't completely congruous. And so I would suggest, and do what you will, but I would suggest ask what you're really meaning versus just saying increase the state share, reduce our recapture. When you're saying those, I think that you're saying we need additional revenue.
Right.
You need to increase our funding. I would suggest saying that instead, because they are quite literally in the process. I think there's about 20 school districts right now statewide that within the next few years are going to be bought out of recapture entirely. And their revenue isn't going to go up a penny in the process. Yeah. Because tier 1 M&O rate compression does that. It reduces a district's local share as your tax rate goes down. And eventually you'll get to a point to where your share is so small, there is no recapture left. That happened to Comal ISD just down the road last year. And so that's why I hope I answered your question. Some more popped up and I apologize. Let me see if I can get this. Okay, I hope that answered your question, Christy. If it did not, please let me know.
Well, Josh, I just wanted to interject here a second. I don't recall. Well, we talked to Gina Hinojosa today, and she said we need to be asking for 7,500. Is that
a little over 7,500 is the number that if you went back to 2019, the last time the basic allotment was increased, and then look at inflation. If just to get the buying power we had through the basic allotment in 2019, it would have to be $7,500. But the cost to do that is about $16 billion for the biennium. That's about $8 billion per year to do that. It's a long shot, and I don't think the legislature will realistically do it, if I'm being completely honest.
Right.
But that's what that number is. That's what Representative Hinojosa is referring to, and she's correct. She's correct. But
you said it's not enough, but it's all she feels like we can ask.
Yes.
One of them, also Vicki Goodwin or somebody was proposing a bill, maybe it was Hinojosa as well, that required as part of the recapture formula to reformulate the weights for economic disadvantage, because Austin in particular struggles with the level of economic disadvantage that we have, while at the same time we have high property values and low numbers of students.
Right. So the state does fund students for, your economically disadvantaged students. It's a very small, weight, or it's actually a series of weights based on how aggregated those economically disadvantaged students are in certain areas. But it's inadequate. It does need to be increased. They increased it a little bit 6 years ago or 5 years ago in 2019, but it wasn't a large increase.
Do you think there's an appetite for that?
I don't see it happening this session. Okay, and I'll do my best to real quick. I'll not keep you all very, very long, but I'm going to try to answer a few of these at the same time. Bring up one more thing. A lot of my clients, a lot of our school districts are asking for, going to enrollment-based funding. And philosophically, it makes a ton of sense. We support that. I support that. It's extremely expensive. It costs about $3.5 billion per year to move from attendance-based funding to enrollment-based funding. And so what happens is, if you're a school district, if the legislature spent that essentially $7 billion for the biennium, and you're a school district that has decent attendance rates, the average attendance rate statewide is about 98%. If you're anywhere around that 98%, your increase in funding is not going to be substantial. the school districts that see the biggest increases in funding, if they were to do that, are the districts with really low attendance rates. And so it's a lot of money that doesn't get dispersed very evenly.
I do know there's some schools, some districts that are really struggling with poverty
Yes.
and the issues that come with that lack of funding. But that is interesting because I know a lot of people are talking about that. What is the revenue? Is Texas just not capable of generating the revenue required to fund our schools? I know we don't have the three-legged stool. We got a two-legged
Right.
stool. And of course, I mean, I want to know, do the Texas voters recognize that they traded out their children's education for this different configured stool? I don't think they do, and I think
I
that's
don't think they do.
we need to be having. It really irritates me. I feel like I'm explaining this all the time. We don't have income tax, and so right, like people complain about taxes. I just wrote a $14,000 property tax check, right?
Yep.
We don't have an income tax, and we would be paying more than that probably in income taxes. And so, but when I heard you say that there's a $7 billion that it would cost if we went to enrollment-based funding, I hope everybody on this call is aware that every state, except for like 6 of us, right? There's 6 or 7 of us. This tells me that they've been cheating us out of $7 billion. Like,
Right.
you can say it would cost them $7 billion, but they should have been paying this the whole time. And so I feel very strongly, and again, Josh, you and I are on the same page. And if I sound grumpy, I am grumpy, but not with you.
I'm grumpy as well, so.
Yeah. So I mean, that is my child's future that this state has been dicking around with and these are real numbers, and these are real numbers that in other states, us as parents, our children those resources would be applied to our children. And right now they are not. And then they make it sound like we're doing something wrong by asking for them to do the right thing. And so I appreciate all these numbers, Josh, because I think every single thing you've said could be turned on its head.
Right. And all these things are necessary. When we say, okay, it costs $3.5 billion a year to go enrollment-based funding, it could cost another $8 billion to get us the basic allotment back to the buying power it had in 2019 because of inflation. Those numbers add up fast.
Yeah.
That's over $11 billion a year right there. Just those two components. We know from the state's own numbers that the state is underfunding special education programs by $2 billion per year.
Billion.
And so there are, category after category after category we can look at and use the state's own numbers. These aren't theoretical and these aren't pie in the sky numbers. These are their numbers. They're underfunding school safety by about $800 million a year, $2 billion a year for special education, and then the money for enrollment. So, there are several categories where we have fallen significantly behind and will probably never fully catch up.
No, they're balancing our state budget and putting money aside like freaking dragons on the backs of our children.
Yeah. So there's the economic stabilization fund that we refer to as the rainy day fund. It's got a cap. It's got a revenue cap. And for the first time in its history, we're about to hit the cap. That's $27 billion that's just sitting in an account. The state does invest it. They just started investing it 2 years ago, but $27 billion is just sitting in the economic stabilization fund, the rainy day fund. There's a question here about the relationship between teacher retirement funding and the ESA. The only relationship I would say with that is that if we start to see a smaller number of public education students, the next thing that happens is smaller number of teachers. And if you have a smaller number of teachers, you have fewer teachers contributing to the teacher retirement system. And if you have fewer teachers contributing, that limits the revenue stream. And there's a point to where it could become financially unstable.
And so, Josh, yeah, I actually heard that that's not like a big gap between where they are now and how quickly it could become destabilized by teachers.
It's financially sound right now, but it's right at that line. It's right. It wouldn't take much to drag it under the line. And so there is a relationship, but that's essentially how that works.
Also, I heard Creighton refer to the educational institutions as vendors. Now, my understanding is, did you hear him say that today? He called them vendors. I thought they hated vendor lists. So when they're creating an approved list.
Yeah, that's okay. I know what you're talking about. Yes. Typically, they don't like creating what's referred to as vendor bills, which are bills specifically for a special group of vendors, businesses. But yeah, that's what the ESA bill creates, a whole new category of vendors that don't even exist today. These educational organizations there'll be about 5 of them, I believe, across the state that will then go through the comptroller to disperse the ESA money to students either homeschooled or going to private school. So those organizations don't exist in Texas. It will create them, private organizations, and they get to take as much as 3% of the total amount of the appropriation. So about $30 million per year.
For the vendors.
Yes.
I thought they hated vendors. And Creighton called them vendors. He didn't even like.
No. I know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Somebody else has a question. Sorry.
Yeah, we got several here, and I'll do my best to get these guys. So back to Margarita, you said, I think the argument was that you say you collect recapture to fund the low tax districts. It's not the low tax districts. It's used to fund districts with low amounts of property wealth. And so it's the equalization. They use it to equalize funding. So if a district is really property poor, that's essentially where that goes back to. Technically, it goes back into the whole system, but that system revenue is funding. It sends a greater amount of funding to property poor school districts, not the low tax districts. Generally speaking, those property poor districts have higher tax rates.
We have TA Vasquez, who is a local hero. TA, thank you so much for coming. She has a question. I'd love to give her a little space.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Daphne. With all the chaos that's going on right now, and I know that you're talking a lot about property taxes, and it's just blowing my mind because we're losing control of our money and what we get to do with it. That's what you're telling me.
Yes, ma'am.
And it's happening, and it's not happening slowly anymore. It's happening every 2 years now.
Right.
Before we had a fighting chance, and now it's like there's some smart people up there that are already predicting this is where we want to be by the next legislative session. They're making plans ahead of us. They already know.
Absolutely.
But what I'm concerned about right now, because we do need money and we need students. Well, with all the chaos that's going on now, I'm afraid that our district's going to be on the losing end of things, because I have families that are already afraid to send their kids to school. They're already making plans to leave. So that's going to drop our growth. I don't know by how much, because there's still families that are hanging in there. So in that respect, I'm curious to know what your other school districts or how they're reacting to what's going on and how they're dealing with it, especially when you're thinking money-wise, right? I hate to think about it as money-wise, but I'm just curious.
I don't have a good answer for you yet because it is so new. And I spoke with several school districts from the Panhandle over the weekend. And some of the ones that have already had this happen, they're very school districts, superintendents in those school districts that have already had, essentially, if we're talking about the same thing that I believe we're talking about, ICE raids, that have already been raided. And so I don't think anybody has a plan yet because it has happened so quickly, or much quicker than a lot of us anticipated, I think, and to a higher degree, an invasive degree than a lot of us anticipated. So I don't think that there is a contingency plan yet. And, you obviously you lose kids, you lose revenue. And so it's going to have an impact. You're exactly right.
Hey, Josh, we're seeing in the campuses that we already have low attendance rates because of economic disadvantage. That there are communities who are really struggling right now with this particular issue.
It's going to have a very real economic impact in a variety of ways.
Are you tracking that? What I would like to see is the cost of bigotry in Texas. I would love to see a budget line item. This is what your bigotry is costing us.
Yeah.
And you're the guy to do it, Josh.
Don't give me something else to do, Daphne. My plate is pretty full, but I agree with you. There are going to be, and the comptroller, to his credit, when he testified before Senate Finance yesterday, had made some comments to this, said, some of these federal actions, for lack of better terminology, they are going to have very real impacts to the Texas economy.
So we were just up in Gina Hinojosa's office talking to her chief of staff. And one of the things that we discussed is having some sort of bill that requires the state of Texas to reimburse districts for this ICE stuff.
Yeah.
I don't know what that looks like. And it sounds like, I mean, Brian was talking about it, but
I mean,
a
you could
vote.
certainly have it drafted. In this environment, it's going the exact opposite direction. I don't know if you heard Chairman Creighton speaking earlier to this. Senator King had asked him in regards to the ESA program, if there was a way to exclude non-citizen students from the ESA program. And Chairman Creighton said, no, currently there is not, but they're going to put in trigger language that says that if Plyer v. Doe, which is the Supreme Court case that says you have to educate students regardless of their citizenship, if that were to ever get reversed, the trigger language in Texas would go into effect and it would exclude all non-citizen students.
Is that part of SB 2? Is that trigger language?
They're going to amend it on the Senate floor to include that.
Wow. Wow.
And I'm just taking his words.
Yeah, no, I heard him say that too. I just wasn't tuned in. Well, it'll be a floor business next week. So I have not been following this, the Senate for the last 40 minutes since we've been on the phone. But my understanding is they think that this is somehow a slam dunk and they want the House to pick it up next week. But then the House just said, we're not showing up next week. So I don't really know.
The plan is for the Senate to pass this first thing next week. They're going to get it in the House's hands immediately. The House doesn't even have committees yet. And so the House is expected to name committees next week, and then they can start to move. But, the House is far behind the Senate on the speed at which they're moving, right now, which is more normal. The Senate's moving extremely quickly. But they told us this. None of this is a surprise. They told us this bill will be the first bill they pass this session.
Mm-hmm. And the Senate always passes this bill. There are mechanisms. I think the House is the only way we're going to stop it. We keep giving the Senate hell, but it doesn't matter. But I will say one of the differences between the Senate and the House, and this is important for us to know, is what you were talking about, Josh, is that the Senate wants programmatic funding, which says, I give you $30 million for teachers, knowing that it's going to cost $300 million. That is a way of degrading our schools, right? And so we need to keep calling that out because it's immoral. I mean, let's not even talk about like the lack of integrity in that sort of action. But the House is where we need to focus our efforts because of that.
Absolutely. That's the only place that we're going to affect change is the House. The Senate has done this, showed us the playbook for enough sessions in a row to where, they are going to do what they're going to do and nobody's going to change their mind on it. We've got opportunities in the House to, actually in the school finance bill, when we get one, we don't have one yet. I know that Chairman Buckley, who is almost certainly going to be the chairman of public education again in the House, it's not a certainty, but I would bet on it. He is interested in a bigger increase in the basic allotment. So, if you have two conflicting bills, a Senate school finance bill that doesn't have a big increase, the House has a big increase, they've got to come to some middle ground. And so, that's our hope. And that's our plan, our advocacy plan.
Okay. And so we're looking at, we're hoping, do you think the House will come up to 7,500 for basic allotment? You think?
No.
I didn't think so either.
If I'm just being realistic from having done this for 25 years, I would say a couple $100 increase.
But there's an election right after this.
There is, we didn't do ourselves as an education community any favors during the last election. In fact, we had all pinned our hopes on the last election, kind of turning the tides, and we lost a lot of ground. We lost a lot of good allies in the legislature, the public education allies, and that, you already had the governor who was empowered specifically on this issue. And after the last election, he's even more empowered. He took out, somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 Republicans because they didn't support, his voucher proposal. And so he feels very empowered right now. And we have less leverage in this moment in this legislative session than I've ever seen again in 25 years for public education.
Okay. Well, that's what we needed to hear.
Well, we had at least 12 advocates in this room this morning.
We had 12 advocates in this room this morning. This is pissing a lot of people off.
It should. And that's the only thing that's going to get, that's going to change things, because the only thing that's going to change the tenor and the direction of the legislature are the elections. What
Yeah.
happened, if you look, we got House Bill 3 is the largest education reform bill in the last 50 years. It was in 2019. Guess what? It happened because the elections in 2015 and 2016 and 2018 were both close. They were both very, very close. The number of Republicans to Democrats in the House got very, very close during those elections, and the lieutenant governor had one very close election. And guess what we got out of it? We got House Bill 3, that large infusion of new money. Since that time, there have been no close elections, and they are not, for lack of a better word, they're not afraid of us as a community at the moment. And that's why we're sitting where we are today. And there's no other explanation for it.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And it was a super frustrating election. Midterms tend to be reactions. And right now we're so closely aligned with kind of what's happening at a federal level that there might be repercussions, but I think you're right. It'll be 2 years and people have to step up. I will say we are focusing on educating everybody here on this call. Your number one goal is to share all of this information with every single person you know, because unless we show up like en masse and show up, we're loud, we're obnoxious, and then we vote, nothing changes. There's nobody coming to rescue us, you all. It is us.
I
And so
think, can we get a specific list of what we need to advocate for? Because it feels very.
number one, $7,500 basic allotment. We're not
To
going to
who?
get it, but that's what we're asking.
That's not in the Senate budget. Or
It's in neither the House nor the Senate budgets at this moment. Now, you have to keep in mind that these budgets historically change a lot from the time they're initially released until they don't typically vote on the actual budget till the end of May. And so it goes through a very long process where they actually take the initial version and then build on top of it. And so I feel confident there will be additional revenue added to it. And here's what you have to work with, without getting into the weeds on the legislature. There are 4 spending limits in Texas that restrict the size of the Texas budget. We're not Washington, D.C. We cannot deficit spend. We can only spend up to the amount of revenue that the comptroller says the state is going to collect over the next 2 years. And then there's another limit that's population plus inflation. So we know what that limit is now, and we know how much the current budgets that are proposed are underneath that spending limit. The Senate is about $6.3 billion under the spending limit. The House is about $4.8 billion under the spending limit. Just in thinking about it in simple terms, that's the revenue we have available to go chase. We won't
Which
get all of
is how
it,
much
but we can get a chunk of it.
So, and
So
just
I've got that piece of it. The second piece is that we should advocate against the ESA vouchers because they're wasteful and debilitatingly expensive.
They're
Wow.
debilitatingly expensive, and from our perspective, and it's an extremely inefficient use of funds. If you look at one thing we do well in school finance in Texas is we don't throw arbitrary money at school districts. We fund districts, we do our best to identify costs. And what I mean when I say that is, we know it costs more to educate a student who's economically disadvantaged, and we have a weight for it. We know it costs more to educate a bilingual student. We know it costs more for career technology programs, and we have a weight for it. We know fast growth districts have some unique challenges. We've gone in and over time done a good job of identifying costs we know districts incur, and then creating weights, creating funding programs for those costs. Now, all of those are inadequately funded, but at least we recognize those costs. The ESA is the exact opposite of that. It's identifying zero cost and just throwing an arbitrary number at the program. There's no identifiable. So you could take the $10,000 ESA and go to a district who has $8,000 tuition, or $20,000 tuition. And that $10,000 reflects that cost, neither of those costs. And so, the same for a special education student. In the ESA that's proposed, they fund special education students at $11,500. But, special education students in the public education system can get to yearly cost of $20,000 pretty easily. And so the state might be spending $20,000 on a special education student in Austin ISD, but if they take the ESA, they're worth $11,500. The amounts are completely arbitrary.
That's just
And
amazing.
does SB2 have any requirements that you have to be, I haven't had a chance to read it. We have full-time jobs and,
I understand. You're excused.
right? Are there requirements that it has to go to kids who were in public schools before?
No, ma'am. It's universal eligibility. So everybody, if you're currently in a private school, you're eligible. If you're currently in a public school, you're eligible. If you're currently in homeschool, you're eligible. Every kid in the state is eligible. Now, they do have language, full disclosure. They say that if one of two things happens, either they have more applicants than they have money for, or they have more applicants than they have seats available in private schools, then they start a prioritization process, which essentially says 80% of the amount of that $1 billion gets prioritized for economically disadvantaged students and special education students. The other 20% goes to any and everyone. So if every student, the estimate right now by the state is, and I think it's low, but the estimate right now is there are about 175,000 students statewide in private schools. Every single one of those students can go apply for the ESA and get the $10,000.
Cool.
And who would, just being practical, who wouldn't?
Right.
I mean, yeah.
Yeah. We see a lot of that in other states. So, and Josh, I don't want to keep you. We've got one more minute and I want to make sure everybody gets their questions answered. But Creighton, in fact, several people were talking about how successful this is and how Texas is so far behind these other states. And yet 3 states just voted. They put it to a vote and they voted it down, even though there were embedded programs. We see states like Arizona, Indiana. Literally public schools closing in Indiana, and they were saying that wasn't true.
Right.
But it is true. And so I need you guys, I need everybody to understand that that is true. It has actually shut down public school systems in other states. We have a mom here who raised her first child in Indiana and saw it happen and unfold. And so even though, and I don't understand the disconnect, I don't know why anybody why would Creighton want his name on something that's going to crater the budget, right? Like, in fact, I keep on thinking, how long has Creighton been in the Senate in charge of this education? This crisis, the 73% of our districts are in financial crisis now. That's a Creighton crisis. This comes from not funding our schools, programmatically funding, underfunding, and requiring all these mandates. So between the administrative costs, which they complain about all the time, right? Without seemingly aware that they are responsible for them. But it is really, this is a crisis that was completely manufactured.
It's entirely manufactured.
I did see some of the testimony today was really great about, in fact, Amy Moore, who is here on our team, did a great piece. So she, said, this isn't the Texas screw up, you manufactured this and it's not solving any problems. Okay. Thank you so much. I do want to throw it out there. Is there anybody else who has any questions? Josh, it is amazing that you have spent this time with us, and this has been hugely, hugely helpful.
I do have one question, I guess, just on its face value. If people who are participating in private education versus public can get state credits for their tax dollars and not using public education, is this just a slippery slope to let people who don't have school-age children go like, well, I don't consume public education? Like, it just seems like on its face, it's a dangerous precedent to set.
Yeah, technically speaking, it's not a tax credit. I get what you're saying because that has been part of the conversation in the past. It's not a tax. Most people, very few people, actually pay in school district property taxes the cost of what it is to educate that student.
Right.
Most people don't pay what the total cost is, and not your total property tax bill, but just your school district component of your property tax bill, which is about 60% of your overall tax bill. So to your question, Leah, that has been brought up before about giving people tax credits who don't have students in, or don't have children in public schools. I've never seen it gain any traction. And the cost is just so unbearably astronomical that I think even for people who, legislators who might like the idea, it becomes debilitating to the state budget immediately. Because
Yeah.
what happens is, if you did that, if you took away those local dollars and said, if you don't have children in school, you get to keep that portion of your tax bill. Well, the school district's entitlements don't change proportionate to that. So then the state has to backfill that with essentially sales tax revenue.
Yeah, well, and I'm not advocating for that.
No, no,
obviously,
I
but just
understand that.
like,
But-
but just is, how is this kind of circumventing that logic?
I just closing comments. I mean, the way I see it is, and this is a cynical view of it, but I don't understand how you could not be cynical after watching this for this long. I see this as, okay, they've chronically underfunded our school districts for the past 6 years. They're creating a whole new system of education that's privatized, and the state's going to fund it. This is a way for the legislature to tell parents in the future, hey, if you don't like your public schools, you don't like the way we're funding your public schools, take the ESA and go to a private school. It's no longer our fault.
Yeah. Okay.
That's how
There
I
is, yeah, no, Josh, I think you're right. And there is no accountability. Nobody, I mean, why they want accountability for teachers. There's no accountability for the politicians. And that's what we're here to do. We are here to provide accountability. That's our mission. I want to thank everybody for coming. I do want to be respectful of your time. We have another meeting next week where we're going to talk more about vouchers with Raise Your Hand Texas. Same time. I think probably a different Zoom link, but it's we'll be sharing that information. Thank you guys so much. And Josh, you rock. Thank you so much for taking your time. I know that you're a busy, busy guy. And this man has been a gift to the Austin Council PTA. We appreciate all of the time. And he has made himself available to us multiple times. And it is huge. Autumn, did you have a quick, or was that a clap? Okay.
Quick clapping. Thank you,
Okay,
Josh.
I love that.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank
Thank
you,
y'all.
guys.
Appreciate you.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
the
much.
invite. And Daphne,
Thank
anytime
you.
I can do anything to help out, just let me know.
You rock. We'll see you when the house brings this up for sure.
Yes, ma'am. I'll be there.
Okay. Thank you guys so
Yeah.
much.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you for showing up, TA. I've been hearing about you for years. I love your daughter. She called me the dope white woman flipping tables for public education. And honestly, that's going to go on my epitaph. That's Cynthia. Speaking, I know she's channeling your vibe, lady. So thank you so much.